Aloha, everyone. I'm going to get started with the e Hawaiʻi. E ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o nā mea huna no e au nā mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o nā mea huna no e mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o nā mea huna no e au nā mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai. Aloha, everyone. Aloha kako. You folks can continue as folks are joining to share your aina and the internal weather you're showing up with today in the chat. Aloha kako. Welcome to session number 2 of the Narrative Change Workshop series that's co-presented and facilitated by Culture Hack Labs and Hawaiʻi Investment Ready. O ke moa ko inoa, calling from the ahupua'a of Kalawao and the moku of Ewa on Oahu. I'm the narrative change director at Hawaiʻi Investment Ready. And I wanted to start the session off with a poem that was used by Auntie Pua Burgess, who was a mentor of several members of the HIR team and many others in this space in her practice of building beloved community. It's called The Prayer of Approach, and it's written by Susan Wright. I honor your gods. I drink at your well. I bring an undefeated heart to our meeting place. I have no cherished outcomes. I will not negotiate by withholding, and I am not subject to disappointment. And with that, I'll pass it over to Andrea to open us up.
Thank you, Kim. So grateful to be with you all and also share this beautiful diversity of languages, of connection, of relation. From the Maya Kichwa world I come from, we have a different way of counting the time. And in our Cholkij calendar count, which has lasted 5,152 years to this day, we are accompanied this day, the 30th of June of 2026, by the energy of the Oshib Ish, which is the energy of community. The Oshib Kawuk is the energy that is inviting us today that may our need to always be right, never make us rigid. The invitation from Oshib Kawuk and the energy of women, community, is that our lives be as malleable as our minds. And it's very important to share this reflection of the day to me with you all because we're moving through 13 days on our time count that remind us that we always have the ability to transform the way we think. Today, the energy of Oshib Kawuk invite us to recognize the courage it takes to acknowledge that we have changed, to accept that what we once believed with absolute certainty may no longer reflect the way we see life. And it calls us to stay open to transformation, to keep learning, to let go of rigidity, and also to embrace an ever deepening understanding of life. So, the invitation for me and also sharing today the beautiful energies of the Nahuales that always accompany us every day is to invite you to make the fear of being judged or our egos needed to always be right never let us to hold on to truths that no longer belong to us or to keep us experiences the beauty of evolving and discovering new answers and changing minds and choosing to think differently and act differently. So the gift that this energy gives us today is the invitation to set our minds free enough to reinvent ourselves and may we have the flexibility to welcome new levels of awareness and as the awakens within us and in each other, because Kawuk is the energy of community and it's represented by the turtles in my tradition. So, with that intention for the session of today, we're going to go to the listening phase. And I pass it on to you, Abri.
Thank you, Andrea. Mahalo. I'm feeling the turtle energy. I love turtles so much. Still slow and steady, we will get there. So today we're going to speak about the listening model, which is the second phase in the methodology. We spoke about ask and your point of view. So we're going to have a quick check-in on how that went for everybody, and hear some of what your feedback and experiences were like. Then we'll share about the listening model and what happens next, where you start to actually actively listen to different narratives in the space that you care about. We're going to share a case study from the Territories of Transition, which is a land back movement that we stewarded, and we'll share how that rolled out and what happened for them. And then we'll talk about next steps and have a nice breakout in different themed groups to talk about what kind of listening you might do, how listening affects your work, and maybe even ways you're already listening and didn't realize it. Next slide. So here we are on June 30th. Welcome. We're in the listen phase. We're going to go after this in August to understand. So, for those who are sort of just following along with the curriculum, we're going to be understanding what listening is so that we can then understand the narrative landscape that we're working with. For those of you that are diving in and really working with the methodology, we're here to help and support you each step of the way. And then we'll move from understand in September into actually rolling out what it looks like to hack a narrative. And then in October is the Bye Bye Con, where you can in person gather and network with HIR and others who are doing narrative change work. So that's where we are in this arc of learning. And last time we worked with ask the point of view. So we're going to take a moment to debrief. We can go to the next slide. Last session, we went through the point of view, which was answering these questions. Who are you? Who is the you that is doing this project? Because it might be slightly different than your organization. It might be a broader collective of stakeholders, or it might be a subset of your organization that's doing the listening and the analysis of this particular narrative space. So who are you? And then once you know who you are, what's the motivation for the project? What's the desired outcome of your intervention? How will your hack actually create change? What is the change you're seeking to create? And why is it useful to state your positionality? So hopefully you were able to sit with these questions, maybe work on them with your teams, even internally in yourself, get some more clarity on what is it we're actually trying to do here. So that's really part of the point of view, is to get situated, grounded, who we are, what we're doing, and why this matters. And so we're going to open it up to the wider group. And if we have some brave volunteers who could share a little bit about how that exercise was for you, and why it might have been useful to state your positionality when working with narratives. We're going to take maybe 2 or 3 shares if folks are courageous and want to offer up. Even if you have a point of view statement, that would be amazing, but there's no expectation. It could just be how this was for you or what you experienced when you sat with those questions with your team. And you can either just unmute or raise your hand, raise your digital hand. And Kim can call on 1 or 2 people if nobody's willing to share. I know it can be intimidating in a group, but you can be brave. I believe in you. Who tried it out?
I don't mind sharing.
Awesome.
I realized that I work on so many different projects with so many different groups, and the most difficult challenge for me was like narrowing it down to what I wanted to focus on for this particular practice. And I've been working on a lot of projects in the past and that have carried on to future work, but something new that came up was with one of our local IAs on Maui and some community concerns and wanting to revitalize that space that is no longer there, that was heavily impacted. And because it's so new, I was able to do some research into it and talk with some of the community. And I think that was the biggest challenge, was like narrowing it down to what is the purpose, that point of view, and looking at, who we are as a group of concerned community members, and then laying out what the purpose was, and what the issue was. So I'm mahalo for, having those instructions and helping me kind of wade into this new possibility. So I think that was one of my biggest challenges, is picking one and what is the focus.
Yeah, mahalo keha. That's so important to highlight. Oftentimes the process and the conversations we have as a result of going through the method can be just as important as the outcome we reach, because you start to coalesce and create different understandings within the groups that you're working with. And part of this creating the positionality is to help us know in the whole world of all the things we could be thinking about, where are we going to focus so we can actually get something done and achieve something in terms of a narrative understanding and a narrative hack. So great. That's awesome. Anyone else want to share how that was for them?
I don't mind sharing a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Aloha everyone. I am with Waipaw Foundation. I have my coworker Kau'i in here as well. Um, yeah, it's similar challenge of there's so many narratives to kind of choose from and to think about, which makes it really hard. And we were able to like go to office hours and try to talk a little bit more, but summer is also just a really crazy time for us. And so like I'm excited to be going into listening because I think that's going to continue to help us like solidify our point of view statement. And we ended up talking about an experience actually happening at Whitehall around a story and confusion around a story that's being depicted in a mural at Whitehall. And so thinking about narratives in a broad sense, but also having a very concrete example of
Mm.
like how our narratives are like represented and carried, not just like to the public, but among our staff and the resources around it. And so I think where we're kind of working in this space of you can still be thriving, you can be thriving, but still struggling as a Native Hawaiian organization to balance it all when that cultural integrity is not cultivated and like intentionally held across like programs and staff. And so I don't know that we've for sure decided exactly where we're landing, but that's kind of where our conversations have been sitting.
Amazing. Mahalo, Faith. Yeah, and that inter-organizational narratives can be so powerful too. We don't often attend to that stuff. So that's really awesome that that came up in your conversations, and finding that way to think about it from that lens. Very cool. Yeah, and with all of this, part of the process is just being in the process. And so knowing that you won't get it right the first time and that this can be iterative and you can go back to the point of view. And as you learn more in the listening and different phases of the method, you might learn something different about where you want to focus. So I think we can go on to the next slide. And there's anyone burning to share. You'll have a chance in the small groups too. So we'll move on to listening, I think. Thanks, Betty. So now we go on to listening. So your point of view tells you where you're standing and what you're trying to change. But before you can change a narrative, you have to understand its shape. So you have to actually listen to it, not just to the parts that you already know, but to the whole landscape. So I want to start with something that we all live inside and experience. And if anyone wants to just popcorn out, stories people tell about Hawaii's economy. What are some of those like prototypical narratives you hear about Hawaii's economy? I have some in mind, but I want to see if others have any they want to share. Just
Tourism is all we need.
Yes. Another one.
Our reliance on the U.S. military.
Yep. One more.
That import dependency is inevitable.
Yep, absolutely. And I'll say one I always used to hear was the three-legged stool of Hawaii's economy, right? So what are these stories that we tell ourselves about our economy? They're narratives and they don't always agree with each other. Some of them are in direct tension, right? Like Kalani said, Hawaii is a tourist destination. That's a narrative, but it also shapes policy, shapes investment, infrastructure, whose vision of the future gets funded or supported. This idea of the military presence. Hawaii's economy should be rooted in aloha aina is another whole way of thinking about Hawaii's economy, right? So depending on the narratives that we're sharing and shaping, this shapes a lot of other real world effects. So the question for us as narrative practitioners isn't which story is true, it's about who's telling each story. Where does that story live? How much power does it hold? Where are the openings for something different to take root or to grow, right? So we're looking at the shape of the narrative, who's speaking to it, how they're speaking to it, where they're speaking to it. And that's what the listening will help us to do. So it's really a method, a methodology for something you all probably do already, but it's going to help you think about it in a different way and get more systematic about it. We can go on to the next slide, which shows our method. This is the context of where we are. We did the ask and now we're in the listen. So when you name your point of view, you identify who you are, what you see, what you want to change, and that's kind of the foundation stone that we build on. So as we move into listen, I want to be clear what we mean by listening is not passive. It's about keeping your ears open. It's listening with all your senses. It's paying attention to what's happening out there in the field, in the narrative that you care about. So you can see where, depending on which point of view you take, you're going to listen to different aspects of the issue that you care about or to the system that you're trying to change, right? So it matters what your point of view is in this way as you move forward. So it's an active research practice. It's how we move from knowing our own perspective as the only perspective to understanding the full shape of the narrative we want to shift. So we're stopping working from assumptions and actually starting to work from evidence. Go on to the next slide. So the goal of the listen phase is to identify narrative communities. We call these narrative communities, but it really refers to the groups of people and organizations who are actively shaping the conversation around the issue you want to change. So like Kalani said, around tourism, if that's the issue you're focused on, you're going to be listening to all the conversations that are happening about tourism, from tourists, from people in the tourism authority, from business owners, all different kinds of people in the system. So we're listening to the stories, headlines, social media, cultural norms, all the ways that people are thinking and speaking about the system we're seeking to transform. That's what we call listening. And the patterns that emerge is what we call the narrative communities. So we're looking for pattern recognition in the conversations that are happening. Sometimes it'll come through as people are popcorning out those ideas about the economy. You're going to hear these same phrases repeated a lot of times. Sometimes it's the shape of the conversation or certain power that's privileged or certain perspectives that are privileged. That will be a pattern that you notice. So thinking about the work in this room, there's all different patterns to the conversations that are happening already about these things that we care about in the communities we serve, in the media, in policy, on social platforms. So some of them are moving where you want it to go, and some are actively working against the issue that you're trying to shift. And some are in between. So you're looking for all of it. You're trying to listen just with an open ear, open mind to see what you find, and sometimes you'll be surprised. So for example, there's the narrative that on community land ownership, some of the dominant status quo narratives you might hear here is, development is a crucial foundation, land back threatens anyone who's not Native Hawaiian, communities aren't ready to manage their own lands, Aina should not be owned, it belongs to the people. These are all narratives that are in this space, right? And some work together, some work against each other. They're all going to be part of your listening. So you're taking notes, you're thinking about these different communities that are popping up, understanding what the landscape looks like. It's like a map of the narrative. And I'll pass it over to Yael to speak to this next piece from point of view.
Thank you, Aubrey. It's really good to be with you all again. I'll go a little bit deeper into the point of view. So the point of view is the starting point for your listening, or the compass, if you will. And the structure that we've shared is we see that, therefore we want to. And so this therefore we want to is what is going to focus your listening. And it's going to tell us which narrative you're engaging with, and that is going to help us really focus the listening. It's gonna get specific around what you're looking for, where you look, and whose voices you're listening to. So in this example, the teen here wants to question the separation between human and nature, which defines land as a resource and and commodity that can be sold and owned. So when they go out to listen, they're not trying to understand everything about land. They're listening specifically for the narrative of land as property to be owned, bought, and sold. So we want to know, where does this narrative live? Who's reinforcing it? Who's challenging it? Where are the cracks? Who is speaking about land not as property, and what are they saying? So your point of view does the same work for you. It helps you focus so you don't drown or get overwhelmed in information. And on the next slide, so once you have your point of view and you've defined it, then you turn it outwards and you start to listen to how the world is actually talking about the thing that you've defined. And you'll almost always find that there isn't just one conversation. There are multiple conversations that are happening simultaneously, and often you'll find them in direct tension with each other. So in this land example, 3 narratives that you'll likely find are land is property, land is money, and land is sacred. So these aren't just different opinions, they also represent different narrative communities with different values, different vocabularies, and also different levels of power in public conversation. So for those of you that are working in the Aina Aloha economy space or in the land and community stewardship space, you'll likely recognize these narratives. And the question of what land is, what it means, and who it belongs to is one of the most live and contested narratives in Hawaii right now. So as those competing stories have very real consequences for the work that you're doing. And keep in mind that some people in your narrative system will also belong to more than one narrative community. So that part of the work and understanding that we'll get more deeply into as well. And this is something worth naming because it comes up a lot. When we start listening, we tend to listen to the people that we already know. So our networks or our allies, the communities we're already in relationship with, and those voices are very important, but they're only part of the whole picture. So this is what we call the echo chamber problem. And often when we're in the echo chamber, we hear our own views reflected back at us. And then we mistake that for the entire landscape. And there's a deeper layer here too, which is that our struggles won't always appear in mainstream conversations. So the narratives that matter most to our communities may be absent from dominant media. And not because they don't exist, but because the systems that determine what gets amplified have historically excluded certain voices. So going beyond the echo chamber is about listening more widely, but also paying attention to what's missing. So the listening model asks us to think about 3 things. The first is where the conversations are actually happening. This is either in mainstream media, government hearings, platforms you're on. The second is, where can you effectively listen? So you have limited time and capacity, so you need to be strategic about where you place your attention. And then thirdly, what are the limitations of those spaces? So every listening context has an element of specific structure and power dynamics. So this is also important to keep in mind. And then on the next slide here, I'll pass this to Kioni to share more about this Olilo Noeo to exemplify what we've just shared.
Yeah, Olelo no Eo. Yeah, I think we've all seen this Olelo no Eo. It is a, Nanaka Maka Ho'olo Ikapapeo Pakawaha. This is a foundational way of how we learn. And I like to think about the listening section really as learning. And paying attention. Pay attention to what's going on, understand the landscape, kind of kilo a bit and observe. Listen to what's going on. This is not about your interpretation of these things. it is about just observing what is and finding patterns of what is. So, like, you're not going to agree with a lot of the dominant narratives, and that's okay. That's the point. You're not, so this is just about laying out a landscape of what is so that we can learn and we can use that data to inform the next steps, to synthesize and use the data for the next steps. So this is kind of how like I processed this, the listening phase when we did this program. So, and and a lot of this stuff is very conceptual and a lot of terminology. I think if you just kind of put it in this frame of listening to learn and observe what is, um, it makes it a lot easier. And then it also like makahana kaike through doing there's learning, right? And so like a lot of these things that you're learning in this process is about, you just got to go through it. You got to try it. And the listening phase can be a little uncomfortable, but if you just take it as pay attention, observe what is, and then try to make sense of it, not to agree with it or disagree with it or emphasize one or make any kind of assessment, but just what is, that's the best approach.
Beautiful. Thank you, Keone. With that, I'll pass to Melandri.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you all again in this space. So yeah, let's move on to the why of the listening model. So we've heard from Aubrey about what it looks like to listen for narrative communities in practice, and also from Yael about how that listening connects back to your point of view. So before I get into the structure, I just want to name something important. Many of you are probably already doing some form of listening in your work, even if you haven't called it that. So if you've ever had a conversation with an elder to understand how they think about land, if you've ever read through community comments on a proposal to get a sense of where people are standing, if you've noticed a topic getting talked about in different ways depending on who's in the room, that's all form of listening. So you've been doing this already. So what we'll be giving you today isn't a brand new skill. It's really just a structure for something many of you are already practicing intuitively, so that you can do it a little bit more deliberately and more thoroughly. So with that, let's look at the structure. So before you collect any data and before you do any actual listening, you need to get very clear on your why. Your point of view sort of tells you where you're standing, and your why will tell you the specific question you're trying to answer through your listening. These are quite related and sort of enmeshed, but different. So your point of view might be something like, I want to shift the narrative around what a healthy food system looks like in Hawaii. Your why, which is your listening objective, is more specific. It might be, I want to understand how our community is currently talking about food sovereignty. Or I want to understand how the food is medicine narrative is landing within the mainstream healthcare institution. The why focuses your listening, so you're not trying to understand everything all at once. So I want to give a little bit of an exercise to everybody. I'd like you all to think a little bit about your why and type it in the chat, but not hit enter yet. And then once you've been given a minute or two to think about it, we'll read a few of these out loud. Yeah, alternatively, if any of you are brave enough, you're also welcome to say it out loud. It's really just the force that's driving your interests around your project, if I can put it more simply. Thank you, Usha. So Usha has written Evolving Philanthropic Center into one based on meaningful relationships with community partners in the lead, with the norm being equitable and regenerative grant-making practices, and funder collaboration taking responsibility as partners in solving for shared systemic challenges. Thank you.
I can maybe explain mine a
And
little bit better than it sounds in the chat.
yeah,
So my focus is kind of the food as medicine movement, which we're working within. And the maybe narrative I want to understand more is why what food we eat, what we eat is considered up to individual choice, which is just something I kind of want to unpack.
thank you. Thanks for sharing, Anna. I think maybe if anyone is brave enough to share one more, then we can move on. Okay, we have another one in the chat. We have two more, but I'll read one of them. So Ethan has said, what did we have to forget about land, about each other, in order to believe that food has to come from somewhere else? That's very powerful. Thank you all for sharing. So yeah, these are just some ideas of, projects and the emphasis that we're putting on this so that you can understand how to position your listening model a little bit easier. So moving on to the next slide. The listening model, as we know of it in Culture Hack, we work across 4 scales, and these map onto 2 modes. So the first 2 are the local and media, which are your small listening, and these are the close human scale sources, conversations in your community, and how local or independent media can cover your issues. So this gives you like more texture and nuance, the things that, we don't otherwise see in big data. The last 2 scales are social media and regional, which are your big listening. So these are the wider scale sources and how people are talking about your issue across digital platforms, how the conversation is happening in other territories around the world. So this helps you to see the patterns across a larger landscape. In order to do a listening, you often need both of these, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, the scales themselves are really important because they remind us that narratives don't just live in one singular place. The story about what the Hawaiʻi food system is for doesn't just live in your community, it also lives in national media, in investment conversations, and in policy documents and social media algorithms. Understanding where a narrative has the most power will help you figure out where an intervention is most possible. And so moving on to the next slide, we'll see how we differentiate between these 2 models of listening that we've mentioned before. So we have the small listening and big listening, and the model that you end up using for your various projects and purposes will depend on your organizational capacity, as well as the nature of the conversation that you're trying to understand. So small listening really allows you to identify, like I said, the nuance and texture in narratives through manual collection of data. These could be as simple as things like surveys, interviews, news articles, a community assembly, and it's really things that you can process yourself without needing any special tools. Big listening identifies like a broader patterns in the narrative space. So often using large data sets, and we normally collect these through social listening tools. It helps you to really understand the shape of a conversation across thousands of voices simultaneously. So there's something important to note about big listening, and it's especially relevant for the work many of you are doing, is that the struggles that we are faced with and that are interesting to us aren't always in the mainstream conversation that we might go looking for. The narratives that matter most to the communities that we're part of are often absent from the dominant discourse. And this is not because they don't exist. It's really because the system that shapes what gets amplified has historically excluded certain voices and certain ways of knowing. So this is why we really have to interrogate not just what we find when we listen, but also what's missing, what's not being said, whose experience are not represented. And ultimately, it's because there's never just one singular story. There's always more than one narrative that we can tell, and the work of listening is partly about finding the stories that carry dignity and resistance, even when they're not visible in the mainstream. So both big and small listening are always guided by your why. You're not trying to understand everything. You're really listening for something specific and from the perspective of your point of view. So moving on to the next slide, we'll see the small listening, the difference between that and the big listening. Small listening is really where we get close to the ground. Again, it's humanly processable, like a community forum or a set of interviews, but it only really works if you've been disciplined about the questions that are framing it. So an example from the slides is I want to understand how Indigenous youth in my community are talking about land ownership. That's my why. But now I need to ask, what themes am I tracking? Is it ownership, belonging, dispossession? These are not the same conversations. Then we'll look at who am I listening to? Youth in itself is a very broad category. Which youth are we looking at? Urban youth, rural youth, those connected to land movements or not? And then when matters more than people think. The conversation about land will sound very different a week after a government announcement about land expropriation than it will 6 months down the line. The timing of your listening shapes your narrative. And then we're looking at which platforms and spaces, because what gets said in a community assembly is not necessarily what gets said on TikTok, and neither of these is what gets said in a WhatsApp or Facebook group. So the geography matters as well. And a conversation about land in Hawaii is not the same as one taking place in Cape Town, South Africa, even if the themes are similar. And then we get to the how. Ultimately, your method will shape what you get. If you sit in an assembly and take notes, you get one kind of data. If you record and transcribe semi-structured interviews, that's a different kind of data. If you conduct surveys, that's yet another kind. So you really need to be intentional because what your method is will determine what you'll be able to work with later. So the big listening works from exactly the same set of questions, the same why, what, who, when, where, and how. The only difference really is the scale and the tools that we need in order to process this data. So the key distinction between small and big listening isn't which is better or worse. It's really what each scale reveals. Small listening gives you texture and nuance, and big listening gives you the pattern, the power, and the proportion. And we use power deliberately here because later when we look at the understand phase, which will be the next workshop, we'll look at something called the attention network and power analysis. And you'll see that the size and reach of the conversation is itself a measure of power in the narrative space. So some of your organizations may already have access to social media monitoring platforms, news aggregators, or even some forms of AI-assisted listening tools. And if you do, this is where they can become very useful. If you don't, it's worth noting as a gap to think about in your work. One important caution as you work at this scale is that big listening has real limitations to it. As Yael said earlier, social media often overrepresents certain demographics, and algorithmic platforms tend to amplify some voices and suppress biases of the platforms themselves, which means the absence of something in your data doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's especially worth noting this if you work with narratives that have historically been excluded from the mainstream. But again, the tools only work if your why is sharp And big data without a clear inquiry just gives you a lot of noise at scale. So ultimately, the muscle that we're trying to build with the listening process is focus, knowing what we're listening for so that we can hear what's actually being said. So, what does a listening model look like in practice? And here's an example of how you might sequence it. So with week one, we could start to poll your communities and networks to get a baseline sense of how people are already speaking about an issue in your orbit. Week two, we move on to national media. How is this mainstream conversation covering your issue? What language is being used? Whose voices are being centered and whose are absent? Then week three, we look at social media. What does the conversation look like at scale across digital platforms? And what are the dominant themes and recurring frames? Week four, we look at regional desktop research. How is this narrative playing out elsewhere in the world? And what can you learn from communities that are working on similar issues in other territories? Week five, we bring it back to the local forum, a discussion, a community conversation, a forum, a gathering. This is where you bring what you've learned back into relationship with the people that are most affected. Sorry. This is one model, but yours doesn't obviously have to look like this. And the sequencing really matters less in the principle. Again, starting with your why and then moving between big and small listening, and finally always bringing it back to the community. Now let's take a look at what we're actually listening for. So this is the listening cycle. You'll notice it's circular and that's intentional. It's not a linear process where you would complete one step and move on. You cycle through these stages multiple times as your understanding of your issue deepens. So once you've done your point of view, you'll begin working on your listening model. And the next thing that the listening process will lead you to is identifying narrative communities. So we'll go into this a little bit deeper, but we're introducing the concept now before the case study because we want you to have it in the back of your mind as you go into your listening. You're not just gathering information, you're really looking for patterns, themes, and groups of stories that have similarities to them. We call these narrative communities. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into how you analyze and work with these, and we'll go much deeper into this in our next session, but today is just about knowing what you're looking for. Next slide. Okay, thank you, Fede. So what is a narrative community? In simple terms, a narrative community is a group of people that are talking to each other about a specific topic in a similar way. They share a language, they share frames, they share a way of making sense of a particular issue. If you think about the food system conversation in Hawaii, if you start listening carefully, you'll notice that not everybody talks about food systems in the same way. Some people may be talking about food security in terms of supply chains and economic resilience. Some are talking about it in terms of aloha aina, of food as a practice of care for the land. Some are talking about it through a health lens, food as medicine. These aren't just different opinions, they're different communities and often have different values, different vocabularies, and different relationships to power. And they're often not in conversation with each other. So as you go into your listening, whether you're working on food systems, community ownership, systemic investing, or any of the other areas represented in this room today, you'll start noticing these clusters. You'll ask yourself questions like, who is talking about your issue, in what register, with what language, and that's where your narrative communities will begin to emerge. So once you start noticing the clusters, you'll find that they tend to fall into a few broad categories. We're not going to go too deeply into these today, but we just want to see these terms so that you start thinking about them. So some communities are reproducing the dominant story. So the typical narrative that you see in the in your policy, institutions, and mainstream media. They're not necessarily doing it consciously, they're just operating from the same map that everyone around them is using. And then we have communities that are actively challenging the dominant story. They're often proposing a different way of looking at things, and they may be your closest allies, the people that are already working toward the change that you want to see. And some communities will sit somewhere in between. These communities are not fully committed to either story yet, but they have networks that connect them to the mainstream and to the emerging alternatives. And these are often the most strategically important communities to understand because they're the ones that can actually move things. So we'll spend much more time with these three in our next session, looking at how you identify them in your data, how you analyze their attention, power, and network. But for now, the most important thing is this. As you do your listening, start noticing clusters of conversation. Start asking who is talking about this and how, and let the communities reveal themselves through your data rather than deciding in advance who they are. So before we move into the case study, just take a moment from everything that we've covered. Is there anything that's landing for you? What is standing out? And yeah, I think we can drop these in the chat.
Want to take us through a little movement, Melandri, before we move on to the case study?
Yeah, so before we move on to the case study, we're going to take a short movement break. So if you're able to, I'd like you all to stand up, and then we're going to do some stretches and move however feels good for your body. So take about a minute and then we'll come back together.
So thank you very much, Melandri. So next, we are going to tell you the story of this process of listening that started in 2023 with the Territories of Transition report. So back in 2023, we started a process inside the Culture Hack Labs for listening towards this project that was named Territories of Transition. And we started with a why. And the why was to find shared frames in the land and commons conversation that could be used by other communities around the world working toward social and ecological justice. So we were starting to think, are there maybe some patterns, some narratives that can help create some coherence between different movements in different regions of the world? And that's where we started listening, right? And we started to listen to the themes, demographics, the data ranges, the platforms, and the strategy of getting this data. In different parts of the world, we used different methods, from interviews to big data listening and processing. At that time, the internet was a little bit different than it is today, so it was a little bit more open. And many of these different strategies of getting data, started to create this big data set that we started to analyze. And we started to search for these narrative communities. And again, just to repeat, narrative communities are those groups, individuals, or organizations who are part of a conversation and who share topics, and language. They might not know each other, right? But they might be using the shared language and frames to talk about a certain topic. And that's why they are a narrative community. So it's a very different thing to map actually communities or organized people than mapping narrative communities. And that's where we started to find these different patterns around the specific area of listening that we started. And we started to listen to these different narrative communities, to community land trust, especially in the global north, to land back movements also coming from the global north, but from resistance spaces. We started to hear a lot about the rights of nature, which was at that moment very early stages of this conversation. Now it's a lot bigger. We started to listen to the comunalidad conversation that is very localized in Mesoamerica, and that talks about what are the different patterns of what community is built in indigenous spaces. But also we were listening to the food sovereignty, ecocidio, which is the resistance spaces, especially in Mexico and in parts of Latin America that are fighting against extractivism, and also bioregionalism, that is this movement that is thinking, how can we organize beyond borders and these like politically created borders, right? So we listen to all these different communities, but in all these different communities, we started to see some domains and patterns that somehow created coherence between different communities, even if they were talking about the same topic, which is land and commons, but in different spaces. We started to see, for example, the pattern of decolonization that was shared by the Land Back to Right Relations movement. And this is kind of a sub narrative of the land back, and we will come back to this. We also started to see the pattern of interdependence and how our healing is bound together and our liberation is entangled. And finally, the pattern of radical relationality. That is, the territory is our body and our bodies are the territory. And again, this is because we had since the beginning this why of trying to find patterns that could create some cross-movement dialogues, right? And from this moment, what we did was actually saying, okay, if what we are seeing are these patterns, then what comes next? To move from narratives to organizing. And I will share a brief video here.
In the era of extermination, where the race for infinite economic growth is leading us to planetary collapse, we call for a reimagining of narratives about our belonging to Earth. Climate crisis, pandemics, forced displacement, mass extinction of species, ecocide, genocide, wars for fossil fuels, dispossession for green energy, fascism dressed as democracy, systems of institutional inequality. The heirs of those who 500 years ago stole the land of our ancestors are today the elites responsible for this environmental, social, economic, and spiritual crisis. Their global system of laws and violence enclosed the land and imposed a logic of property based on extractivism. Culture Hack Labs call for land back to right relations. We call on those who seek to transform the dominant narratives of land ownership. We call on those who are part of diverse and anti-colonial movements, those who seek to decommodify the land and create regenerative models, those who belong to indigenous resistance and defend the territories, those who plant the seeds of ancestral futures. From Milpa America to Alakshak, this is our call to join the territories of transition, a narrative change project to give back to the earth our condition of existence. from that process of territories of transition, we as Culture Hack were very embedded into working with land defenders from different regions of our continent to create an action to investigate what is behind the narratives around land and ownership, and what's the narrative possibilities for us to move that window of discourse. So when we started to work and also to call this amazing group of people just like you, were invited through this video and a public call to become part of the Territories of Transition Laboratory, a lot of people responded. And it was an amazing gathering from 25 land defenders from different nations, indigenous nations, and different communities that were working around land. So when we started to work with them and starting to reach and see what was possible, we started to build by building together our point of view. So when we started, for us, the first thing that we wanted to shift and the action that we wanted to create, it's to question and also to see what are the separation between people and territory and the relationship that it's looking at the land as a commodity. So basically we came with a point of view that said that we were a coalition of indigenous and non-indigenous land defenders. We see that the narratives of land ownership are reinforcing separation between human and nature. So we wanted to deepen the conversation of land back as an objective. To achieve this, we must remind each other as movements that we need to slowly return to right relations with Mother Earth. And that point of view came from this being together process, placing our intention and answer our why, where we can find the land back to right relations conversation. And this came also with a lot of inquiries. The first inquiry that we wanted to understand was understanding youth, hearing youth, listening to youth. What is relationship between land and spirituality conversation in the youth in some of the communities that the participants from territories of transition were willing to open a dialogue with? The second inquiry was that we wanted to understand how can indigenous narratives exist in non-indigenous context without a similar connection to the land? How these narratives are living inside these non-indigenous spaces. And the third inquiry is that we wanted also to listen the Black, Indigenous, and people of color movements and resistant collectives, and also the indigenous voices inside those communities that we're talking about sexual diversity and different diversities around land and also around how we are organizing within each other as movements. So those were the first inquiries that we wanted to place our whys, like we wanted to listen to youth, indigenous narrative in non-indigenous context, and BIPOC resistant collectives. So what we decided to do as a listening model through the territories of transition process began with the cohort doing some interviews to some members of their communities and people from those communities that they were placing their inquiries very specifically. So we created a Google form template where they went to do interviews to people from their community. They were willing to listen to understand these three important spaces. The second week, we used basically monitoring social media, national media, and going through different media outlets that were available to us in different languages. And something that was very beautiful and complex from the process that we did in territories of transition is that half of our cohort was in Spanish and indigenous languages in those parts of the region, and English and also their traditional languages in those parts of the region. So we had to think about listening very multilingually and how to allow the reflections to come and become part of our listening process. Something that was very special was when we discussed the use of the big, like scaling up from the small listening, everybody in their community, interviewing 5, 10 people, then monitoring manually social media outlets, and then to do the big jump to, get these big ears with all the digital tools that we have available now, to listen to the social media, to go to check on patterns, to also listen to this conversation in communities that we were not part from, that we wanted to also understand their landscape because those communities are also important or influential or in relation with us. And that was very useful because it started to allow us to understand the patterns. What are the patterns inside that conversation? What are the communalities, or where are the very specificities of the conversation in these very different regions? And then something important that came together, right? When you have 25 people from 20 different parts of the region interviewing 10 to 20 people coming together, that's not longer a small listening. That becomes more regional. And also, we complemented it with a lot of also narrative research. We went to listen to academics. We went to use a lot of scrapping through other tools we had to do research on social media and also media landscapes. And that allows us to create a very interesting repository of listening space. And also, that allows us also to make a last jump. The listening process doesn't happen all at the same. And at the same time, it doesn't end when you have the week 5, when you need to grasp everything together. It's a constant exercise. And also for us, something that was very important for the territories of transition process is that the listening model didn't end up when we did the big and also the small listening, but also when we gathered together. For the in-person gathering that we had in Costa Rica later on that year, one very specific and beautiful moment was to have a listening space inside our own gathering, to reflect on what we found during our listening process, but also to create some narrative recommendations and also some narrative takeaways from what we learned from listening within each other. And there were some important listening takeaways from that conversation. First, that other relationships with the land, indigenous sovereignty conversations were not present. Something that was very important for us to understand that there was mental health and connection with spirituality conversation more present in some of the communities that we listened. There was something that was very important as a takeaway, that it was understanding that ancestral knowledge is a bridge between indigenous and non-indigenous as part of where the conversation is happening. And we understood also a lot that there was a lot of cross-movement solidarity between the BIPOC community liberation movements. That was very interesting. So we wanted to understand the conversation on land ownership. How can we deepen on the land back? But at the same time, we had 3 different inquiries. So within the indigenous youth, there was a conversation around mental health and spirituality. Between the non-indigenous communities, the conversation was around ancestral knowledge, and that was the bridge between the non-indigenous having dialogues and conversations with indigenous communities, and the cross-movement solidarity increasing into the BIPOC liberation movement. So that was very important for us to understand and also to reiterate by the listening space. And that allowed us to understand and take some decisions. Something, we have shared, that we decided to choose as catalytic communities, or what we do so-called audiences, were first those who already support the land back narrative. So that was for us a very catalyst community, the people that we actually wanted to open the dialogue, deepen the dialogue with. And then the second was that to see the land back to right relations with a frame that can push a conversation towards justice, access for land, like housing, social movements, social justice. But also, land back to right relation will be a frame that can allow us to move toward not only justice access, but also to shift the way we relate to land, to do not also place and center the conversation around ownership, but about relationality. So that was very important part of what we wanted to create. And then, therefore, we moved to understand the narrative space that we were building. So what we found during our research and listening process, it was that there were a lot of private property conversations that was very big, that was very present when we research around land. But there was a conversation around land back that was already there as an alternative to this oppressive system of talking about land and treating land as a commodity, and to start talking about land back to communities. And for us, it was moving that conversation toward the ontological shift we wanted around the back to the land as a frame that can allow us to think on how we can regenerate our ways of being and existing in this planet, that we do so-called regenerative systems. So we have conversations that reinforce systems of oppression or that can plant regenerative systems. And that was very important and beautiful to build collectively within the movement. Something that we learned and that it's important to reiterate is that narrative work and listening and researching itself will not change the space. We need to use narratives from organizing, and that's the spaces where we really, really work also within the land defenders. So during our gathering with the land defenders from Turtle Island, Pacific and Atlantic Islands, and the Mesoamerican region, we work together to create narrative actions that can create a trans-territorial conversation about land ownership. And that was our main goal. And that was very important because it was bringing together people from different narrative communities, different indigenous contexts, different nations, different ways of relating to land and territory to come together and create common senses. Some of the narrative actions that we built and crafted collectively from this process was a conversation around debt. There was, especially in the North American part of the world, conversation about the students' debt, how native and indigenous diasporas that are coming from the south to the north now lived in debt. And they were trying to move that conversation and talk about land. They dispossess the land in our communities with extractive projects. Actually, they owe us. No? So this narrative action was crafted around that, talking about justice. Then the second action, Somos de la Tierra, or We Are from the Land, was about how do we go back to the land to work within the communities that are protecting and in the front line of defending the land right now. How this can be a cross-solidarity movement. And it was very beautiful, the conversation in very different languages between the land defenders to talk about those. The third one was Recipes for Revolution. There was a group also that wanted to focus on food systems, food liberation, and to talk about how we wanted to create and raise awareness on indigenous communities that are protecting seeds, and also the farming movement inside indigenous communities that are the ones that are closer to the land. So how do we open up a dialogue with those communities? And it was through collecting the recipes of ancestral dishes, and also what are the recipes for building a revolution, of organizing together. So the narrative action was very beautiful and poetic. And the fourth one, that it's called Caminos Ancestrales, or Ancestral Paths, was a conversation about being indigenous and diasporic, what it has meant to a lot of indigenous communities in Central America, for example, to be displaced from our motherland and have been in exile or displaced by climate change, by the policies of the nation states. And a lot of indigenous people now are living in the United States as illegal immigrants. And what it means to go back to the land. What does that mean to us as diasporic communities? And also an opening conversation on we're bringing our territories with us. So what we are also bringing from our territories to these nations that are now our territories? So it was a very beautiful conversation that led us to something that we really, really appreciate that happened. That was 10 principles that came from the land defenders that are called the back to the land principles. And what we say is that land back is a strategy that can be legal, that can be political, but back to the land is our ceremony. That we wanted also to deepen our relation and shift the way colonization has, break a lot of the relationality we had with our motherland. So what that was important for us to also create some technology, some narrative infrastructure and tools to share with other movements that are also working towards land. And we said at the end, we light this fire, sit in a circle to sing and share stories with those who believe that the land is our condition of existence. So for us, allowing that space of organization with land defenders also meant to start thinking and measuring the impact of the narrative work as something deeper. First, to see our impact on the construction of shared narrative strategies, the creation of shared discourses among different land defenders in different regions of the world can flourish within the movements and can shift culture. And that was very important. For us, for example, from people coming from the Mesoamerican region, Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Honduras, sometimes we're not aware of what are the conversations and the similarities in our struggle with the native communities, native nations in other parts of the world. So creating that narrative and shared discourses is very potent. Also, something that for us is very impactful is to talk about the borderless convergence, the collaboration between different organizations and diverse groups within the land movement to open up a trans-territorial dialogue and action is very, very powerful. And then the third impact, as I had mentioned, the possibility of just doing this research together to put together all our reflections and offer it to other movements, other experiences that are also, sharing the same inquiries is something that we wanted to give, have narrative tools that can allow us to measure the impact in the catalyst communities. And that means to push the narrative towards justice and ontological shift and generating a narrative infrastructure for the long-term change, because that's also something that we always share. Change is always possible, but it never lasts. We always need to keep moving to make it. And a very beautiful impact that we love to share about this process of the territories of transition is that the Back to the Land Council was created, a trans-territorial multilingual space where land defenders can meet, can reimagine how they hack the land ownership narratives. It's still there. We have amazing folks in Puerto Rico, in Honduras, in Hawaii, in California, in the Canada states. So this is like a very diverse group that still organized together, that sometimes came together to reflect or to be in solidarity within communities. And I think that's on my end. And I hope you have some good takeaways from this exercise that we did a few years ago with the Culture Hack team.
Thank you, Andrea, and everyone else. Amazing. Lots of information to digest. And we're going to have time now to talk in our small group. So we've divided everyone up according to issue areas that you're working on to see if there might be some, different coherence between your projects and things that you're thinking about. And we're going to have a chance to answer these two questions here that we're on. I'll put them in the chat. But it's really, from your work. And if you want to think about this, maybe even jot some notes as I read the questions. From your work, what is a narrative that you keep bumping into that seems to be blocking the change you want to see? So this would be a dominant narrative that you're up against, something like, Hawaii needs the military for its economy to survive. That might be a dominant narrative that you're seeking to change. So what is one narrative that you're bumping up against in your work? And then your why. From your work and movement perspective, what are you interested in learning from the narrative landscape in Hawaii? So when you think about, why am I doing this listening? What am I curious about? What am I hoping to learn? What would you answer to that question? And we'll have some time to discuss. Each person will have about 3 minutes to share in the group. And then if there's extra time, we have a couple of bonus questions we can talk about with you. Every room will have a facilitator from our team. So we'll guide the conversation and keep you on time. We'll have about 35 minutes in our groups. I think Melandri has made the breakouts at this point. So go ahead and join your breakout. We'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. We wanted to open the floor for a few minutes for some share outs to the big group. What came through, what maybe surprised you, or an insight you had, or something you either shared or heard someone else share. You can unmute or raise your hand, whatever you prefer. Oh, Betty was right in the middle of a beautiful sharing. We could finish it if you want.
Maybe if Santel wants to share a little bit in the group, because I think it was a beautiful question.
Yeah, so I think just in general, the question was around, as we talk about these kinds of frameworks, how do we ensure that there is a place for Aina to speak and be a part of the conversation without depending on the human element to translate what it means? Because we all are sort of affected in some way with our own individual interpretation of what Aina is trying to say. And how do we create like this solid North Star, I don't know, constitution, whatever it is that recognizes the Kanawai and the Kapu of like areas, and really listen to that as like just foundational, so that our politics, our trauma, or whatever is not in any way tainting what Aina is trying to say to us as we navigate through the listening. Because I guess the question I was asking him is, if we know that we have to listen, the part that we're not listening to a lot of times is Aina. We're speaking for it, we're interpreting it, but there's a place that is necessary to solidify that Aina can speak for itself. And what does that look like, and how do we incorporate that? So the example I gave is like, we get back the land and we want to do affordable housing, but we never really take into consideration how the Aina can afford to do what we need to do on our land. And so and then that target is always moving, right? Because it's like, oh no, but our people are suffering. Oh no, but the water, and so it's this constant like conflict. And so I was just curious about how this group could reimagine the way that we take Kanawai and the way that we honor Kapu, and then really make it a part of the design in decision making and in these conversations, so that Aina can be heard firsthand instead of watered down by interpretation.
Mahalo, that's amazing. And a beautiful possible outcome of this group is to come up with a way to think about that and share that out. Thank you, Chantel. Other thoughts, inspirations, questions that came through in the groups or that you're sitting with now? Betty, I think you're talking, but you're muted. Oh, no. Something else. Who else would like to share? Just a couple more, and then we'll go on to next steps. We good? Okay. No questions then, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So we'll go on to next steps, Betty, if you want to share that slide. And do you want to share our next steps for us, Betty?
Yes. So the next steps have to do with how to create our listening model. And I think that this question that arises on how can we also listen to the earth, to the web of life, I think for me it's also a great interrogation of, like the limits of our own models, right? And also understanding that this limit is also, like the tool that we are working with, and that it's expandable. So that's why I think these kind of groups have so much more to add to this kind of listening models. But basically the idea from today and next time we see each other is actually starting to do this listening process. And we start this by the why, right? And the why is, like, what do we want to know, the inquiry that we want to answer with this listening process. And then going into a small listening action. And we will propose a couple of actions that if you don't know how to proceed, you can be part of this bigger listening that will be part of the workshop. But also, if somehow you are interested in creating or developing your own listening actions for your project or your organization, we will make sure that you have some guidance and some tools to make this happen. And finally, like with these different parts of your listenings, your different whys, we are going to create this big listening of the whole group. So we will let you know, we will send some information after the call so that you can know where you can start. Okay. And for this, we want to share like this timeline of the process where we are going right now. We came from this May, June point of view and listening phase. And we will have until August, the end of August, to do our listening and to start our understand phase, which is basically processing and making sense of our listening. Next, we will move into September, which is the online session number 4, where we will start to create a strategy with what we processed and the learnings that we had from this listening. And we will start to think in a more strategic way on how we can apply this in a communication and a narrative strategy. And finally, on the 15th and 16th of October, the YYCon, where you will be able to meet together and put some of these ideas into a more specific plan, right? So this is how it looks like. And the listening phase is such an important foundational part of this because it will give us a lot of the information that we need to move to the next phases. And for this, we will make available some of these tools that we have in Culture Hack. And of course, you can use them if this feels like it's useful for your listening, but also it is optional, right? We have been developing inside the Culture Hack, into the Culture Hack Labs, a big listening data tool. So normally the big listening data tools that are available out there are very much thought around marketing. And we are trying to build our own tools thought from the ground up for systems change. So we have already a big listening data tool that we will make available for this group. But we will have to start deciding how to make this available for those who are interested. We are also going to make accessible some AI agents. Just to make a small note on this, at Culture Hack Labs, we acknowledge the impact of AI and extractive tech and data centers. And that's why we are actively working on dismantling big tech influence in our narrative work and building tools for technological autonomy. So more on this to those who are interested around our positionality on these tools, how we are building this, how we are making this open source so that you can either use it in commercial platforms like Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or all these different corporational tools, but you can also run these locally in your computer. So for those interested, we will send some tutorials if you are interested, and you can keep these agents working with you if that's what you are interested in. So again, we have some different and very specific agents. One of them, I think it's very useful because it's a general Q&A around the Culture Hack method. So anytime you have a question about the method or you need even, like explain to me this without using a lot of this jargon of, like the culture hack jargon, you can ask these tools to actually help you understand part of our narrative process. We are also we developed a point of view agent that can help you refine your point of view and develop a why for the listening model. So if you feel like you need some support on that, this agent can help you in working with this. The third one is a listening model. So once you have your why and your point of view, it can help you design your listening model with the tools that you already have. So let's say that an organization already make some polls or already make some interviews or already make some group work. This tool can help you use your already existing tools and develop them into the culture hack method framework, right? And finally, a research agent. If your organization doesn't have access to, let's say, big data monitoring or social media monitoring, this agent can help you create some research, some listening around big data. So that will also be available. Some notes about these agents is that they are built the ground up like for non-extractive action, right? And we have a very specific proposed AI fluency and ethics that, again, for those who are interested, we can share a little bit more. You can install them. They are open source, so you can install them on your own platforms if that's what you want, or we will be making some of these accessible through our platform from Culture Hack Labs. So also for those interested, just reach to us and we will tell you a little bit more about this. And finally, just to note that every agent has a hacking mode, which gets straight answers and outputs from the agents, but it has a learning mode. So if you are interested in learning more on the step-by-step and what is behind this process, you can ask the agent to actually tell you, okay, don't give me all the answers, just walk me through the process and explain me. And of course, ask me if that is related to what I actually want, right? So again, those interested, we will send this in a following email, and those interested will join a Signal chat where we can talk a little bit more about this. I will give some tutorials, instructions, and give access to this if that's what you want. And just to tell about the office hours, I will ask Aubrey to share a little bit more about the office hours.
Thank you, Fede. Yeah, so office hours every Tuesday from 11 to noon. Just come with whatever questions, or even if you want to listen to what other people are sharing, it's really open. Kim and I will hold that space. And if you need another time, just let us know and we can find a time to work with you directly. So bring your questions, bring your curiosities. And then I think we'll turn to Kim to close us out. I'm curious, if you feel like you're drinking water out of a fire hose, that's okay. This is correct. It's a lot we're moving through. Just use the office hours or reach out and follow along the process, and you'll see where we're taking you. And I'll pass to Kim to close us out.
We understand that everyone's coming from a different level of capacity, so we're really trying to meet you folks where you're at. If you can't make the Tuesday office hours, just email me and reach out, and we can schedule some separate time for whoever is interested. But I'm going to close this out with something from Norma Wong's book, When No Thing Works, a Zen and Indigenous perspective on resilience, shared purpose, and leadership in a time place of collapse. So she says, this is from a chapter titled Worldview. A fact exists not in and of itself, but as a data point in a field of what it is we believe. The field is a field, a tapestry, a bowl of stew, a story of many chapters that come from a cohesive collection of stories, not a single data point. The data point is evidence, a tiny window into an entire worldview. The interpretation of the relevance of the data point and the subsequent story of the string of data points furthers our understanding of the world. one that may intersect with or entirely diverge from the worldview of another person. And then she ends that chapter with this. If a horizon story, near or far, has resonance beyond its principal storyteller, it is because it has strong underpinnings in which many stories may be told, many peoples find themselves in, innumerable scenes of work in progress. This is the emergent worldview. Aspire to nothing less so. And if you can, before you go, please drop one word takeaway in the chat. We really appreciate the feedback. Mahalo nui, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. See you soon. Be well.